Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Hammer. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs, and I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's program, South of Pico, about how the artists in Los Angeles' Black communities during the 1960s and 70s created a vibrant, engaged, activist art scene in the face of racism and social upheaval. Our guest speakers are the author of the new book, South of Pico, and the curator of the Hammer Museum's groundbreaking 2012 exhibition, Now Dig This, Dr. Kellie Jones, and the artist and co-founder of the Brockman Gallery, Dale Brockman Davis, UCLA professor of English, Uri McMillan, and UC Irvine professor of art history and African American studies, Bridget. Before we begin, I want to ask you to please silence your cell phones, and I also want to invite you all to join us for the Hammer's major new exhibition of feminist Latina artists called Radical Women, Latin American Artists 1960 to 1985. This exhibition opened in September, and there's been an extraordinary response both in the press and from visitors to the museum. So I hope that if you haven't seen it yet, you'll come back to the museum. We're open every day except Mondays, and admission is free. Also, we have some great public programs coming up. Tomorrow night, we have a concert by the Burnt Sugar Orchestra, performing their take on Max Roach's Freedom Now suite. On Sunday, we have a panel discussion about the forced sterilization of Black and brown women in Los Angeles in the 60s and 70s. Next Thursday night, we have a blowout concert of alt Latinx music with the bands Sotomayor and Sin Color out in the Hammer Courtyard. And on November 21st, Neil deGrasse Tyson will be here for a special Hammer members-only screening of the documentary film Food Evolution, which he narrates. So it's a great time to join the Hammer. If you'd like to receive reminder emails about our upcoming events, please sign up for our email list in the lobby, or you can always find out more on our website. For tonight's program, we're going to first hear a presentation from Dr. Kellie Jones about the research in her new book, South of Pico, and then we'll have a roundtable discussion with her and Uri, Bridget, and Dale, and then we'll take audience questions, and then we'll have a book signing out in front of the theater along with some coffee, tea, and cookies. So now I'd like to introduce our speakers. I'm going to introduce everybody at once, but then Kellie will come up, and then all of our speakers will come up after her. Dr. Kellie Jones is an associate professor in art history and archaeology at Columbia University, where she's also a faculty fellow with the Institute for Research in African American Studies. Her research interests include African American and African diaspora artists, Latinx and Latin American artists, and issues in contemporary art and museum theory. She's received numerous prestigious awards for her work, including awards from Creative Capital, the Warhol Foundation, and the MacArthur Foundation. Her scholarship has appeared in many exhibition catalogs and journals, and she's the author of two books, I-Minded, Living and Writing Contemporary Art, published in 2011, and of course the new book, South of Pico, African American Artists in Los Angeles in the 1960s and 1970s. And we have a really wonderful recording of her in 2011 when she came out with the book I-Minded, and came here and did a dialogue with her father, the late Amiri Baraka, and you can see that on our website. Dr. Jones has also worked as a curator for over 3 decades and has major national and international exhibitions to her credit. Now Dig This, Art in Black Los Angeles, 1960 to 1980, here at the Hammer, was named one of the best exhibitions of 2011 and 2012 by Art Forum, and Best Thematic Exhibition by the International Association of Art Critics. She was co-curator of Witness, Art and Civil Rights in the 1960s at the Brooklyn Museum, which was named one of the best exhibitions of 2014 by Art Forum. Dale Brockman Davis hails from Tuskegee, Alabama, and moved to Los Angeles with his family at the age of 10. Davis graduated with a BFA in ceramics and teaching credentials from USC. He went on to teach at Dorsey High School in LA for many years, where he taught ceramics, jewelry making, and other art forms. And out of frustration with the lack of exhibition opportunities for artists of color at established galleries and museums, Dale and his brother Alonzo opened their own gallery in Leimert Park in 1967 as a place dedicated to showing work by minority artists. The Brockman Gallery nurtured the careers of many artists just beginning to gain recognition, such as John Outerbridge and David Hammonds, and supported artists who had already achieved some success in mainstream and black art circles, including Romare Bearden and Noah Purifoy. In his own artwork, Dale creates new types of sculptures that explore an African American past, working through ceramics and assemblage. Dr. Bridget Cooks is an associate professor of art history and African American studies at UC Irvine. She also serves as faculty in the Irvine PhD programs in visual studies and culture and theory, and the master's program in critical and curatorial studies. Her research focuses on African American artists, Black visual culture, museum criticism, feminist theory, and post-colonial theory. She earned her doctorate in the Visual and Cultural Studies program at University of Rochester and also worked at the Oakland Museum, the National Gallery of Art in D.C., and at LACMA. And she's curated several exhibitions, including The Art of Richard Mayhew at the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco. She's the author of the 2011 book, Exhibiting Blackness, African Americans and the American Art Museum, and she's currently working on her second manuscript titled A Dream Deferred, Art of the Civil Rights Movement and the Limits of Liberalism. Dr. Uri McMillan is an associate professor of performance studies in the departments of English, African American Studies, and Gender Studies here at UCLA. His teaching and research interests include performance studies, cultural studies, aesthetics, feminist theory, and queer of color critique. He's the author of Embodied Avatars, Genealogies of Black Feminist Art and Performance, published in 2015. So now please join me in welcoming Kellie Jones.
Hello. So great to be back here in LA. Thank you all for coming out today. Thanks to Claudia, thanks to the Hammer, Director Annie Philbin. You know, such a wonderful moment in 2011 when I was able to do Now Dig This here, and it's great to be back here for this version of Pacific Standard Time. LA, La La, I don't know what you all are calling it. And now my book is out, but there's a lot of great stuff here that I've seen already. So, you know, the book, and by the way, the slides are just rolling because why not? I'll talk about them, you'll get it, you'll see them over and over again. You say, that's what she was talking about. So that's the way we're rolling with this today. But, you know, when I had actually been at work on this book before Now Dig This, and I was out here doing research, and I ran into Gary Garrels, who was then senior curator at the Hammer, or chief curator, and I ran into him in Bergamot Station, and he said, "Oh, what are you working on?" And I said, "Oh, I'm working on this book on African American artists in Los Angeles in the 60s and 70s." And he said, "Oh, when will you, will you do a show?" And I said, "Yeah, when I finish the book." And he called me up 2 weeks later and he said, "Is your book done?" Because I have this great opportunity, which turned out to be Pacific Standard Time. And what it allowed me to do is work with great artists like Brockman Davis. Really, he's one of my guardian angels on the show. And also be able to go into these archives, because if you're just a scholar and you say to the Whitney Museum, "I want to see one work," they're going to be like, "Sure." But if you're doing an exhibition, yes, the doors are open. So it allowed me to see some things in real time that I had actually only seen in bad reproductions. So that was a great opportunity. It was a great opportunity to get some artworks scanned with high-resolution images for the first time, great pictures. And what I loved about the Getty Project itself was that they said, this is a baseline of research. This is not the end of the story. This will be the beginning of the story. And so I always think about that, right? You're not creating the definitive text. And so I really appreciated that. And then once the show, traveled, came to New York, to MoMA PS1, and then went to the Williams College Museum of Art, then I got back to the book in earnest. And so voila, here is the book, South of Pico. Both the title, Now Dig This, and the title, South of Pico, were thanks to my great research assistant at the time, Naima Keith, who is now deputy director at California African American Museum and is actually having an event tonight. But I, thank her in absentia, because she, is an Angelina, and she kind of schooled me in at least South of Pico, which, it's like in Los Angeles. Los Angeles speak for the other side of the tracks. So I had another title, and I said, no, this has got to be the title of the book. So the book, I'll just tell you a little bit about it, and then I'll read a little bit from it, and then we'll have my great panel come up and we'll talk about it. So the book is basically in 4 chapters, and the difference between the book and the exhibition is the book really, one fundamental difference is that the exhibition really focused heavily on 36 artists, whereas the book really focuses on 13, and really much more in-depth research in the book on those 13 artists. But also the other fundamental difference is that what I was thinking about is the impact on artists of African American migration. One of my, guides for thinking about this, my intellectual guides, was Farah Jasmine Griffin, and she has a book called Who Set You Flowing, and it's about what she calls the migration narrative, and she's an English professor, looks at literature, and her idea is that the migration narrative is the great modern narrative of African American life. So I thought about that in relationship to artists and how artists, how did artists visualize this? How did the idea of, the majority of Black people basically moving since the end of slavery, but mostly thinking about the 20th century, how did that movement out of the South to the North and West in what we call the migration impact visual art, both materially, but also discursively, just in terms of thought. So, that was the kind of what I really thought about, in terms of a main issue that I tried to, or a question that I tried to answer in this book in different ways. The first chapter, Emerge, looks at Betty Saar, Charles White, and Melvin Edwards in very different ways. Charles White, comes here. He's one of the most well-known African-American artists in the country. He comes here in the 50s. He really gets picked up in the 60s with a gallery, but in between that, he's showing in different places. And really, his presence is even announced in the LA Sentinel. There's an article in the LA Sentinel that says, Charles White arrived on the so-and-so train to LA. So he was that kind of a presence. And so his presence really jump-started, I think, for a lot of people, the idea that there would be some activity here, or more activity than previously. Melvin Edwards became one of the first art stars. He showed at LACMA when it first, becomes LACMA after it was just the LA County Museum, not of art, LA County Museum. His work is on television. And that was another thing. A lot of these artists are in, what is the relationship with Hollywood, right? Charles White, is collected by people like Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier. And so they also bankroll some of these early exhibitions. And then Betty Saar, she, grew up here, unlike Charles White, who originally was from Chicago, came from New York, came to LA, and Melvin Edwards, who has a kind of classic migration from Texas to LA. Betty Saar was born in LA and, goes to LA schools, she goes to UCLA, actually. And they steer her into interior design. You're not really cut out to be an artist. So she fights back against that, in her career. But she starts out with prints. She starts doing prints because she's a mother. And this is, what can I still do as a woman and keep being creative? And I think, people often shy away from that narrative. But I think these... we have to really think about that as an important thing, because women are still creative. They still make that commitment. They decide what works best for them in different contexts. So that's chapter 1. These are the people who I thought were important people who kind of pushed the Black LA art scene and the LA art scene forward. In chapter two is Claim, and that is Betty Sargent, John Otterbridge, and Noah Purifoy. And they all work with Assemblage, or Assemblage if you prefer. And they do it for different reasons. Betty, moves some prints into mixed media sculpture and has a real spiritual, kind of sheen to it. She is a great example for many artists that would come later. David Hammonds, Houston Kahn will just really adore her at that time. She becomes a great example for them because, Melvin Edwards leaves, Charles White's doing some other kind of work, but Betty's really doing this mixed media work. And also it's about a global kind of idea, right? She's looking at Latin American culture, Latinx culture. She's looking at Asian cultures, right? She's not, quote unquote, just looking at Africa, but she's also looking at African and African American cultures. And she said, this is all my culture. I am a person of the world, right? Even though she's basically based in LA the whole time. But she's also the art star who really, her work goes east pretty quickly. And even though she's older, because she's a woman with 3 kids, she really makes an impact in New York. John Otterbridge and Noah Purifoy both kind of start out, in many ways, making the community their artwork, right? They are trained as artists, but in the 60s, you remember, there are no real places for African Americans to show, and we'll get to that in a minute. And so they start working with communities. Noah Purifoy is the first director of the Watchtowers Art Center, and then John Otterbridge comes later. But he's also working in Compton before that, and they're really dedicated to, bringing art to communities that are underserved. Perhaps, and the difference between their work is Otterbridge really, I feel, as I narrate in the book, kind of channels this kind of Southern aesthetic, if you will, of creativity. And Noah Purifoy, actually, it's really when the Watts Rebellion hits in 1965, he says that's what really makes him an artist. And Assemblage is, already a big style. It's celebrated at the Museum of Modern Art in 1961. And he decides, in the wake of the Watts Rebellion, he is going to make a group show with other artists, where they're going to use the remnants from the rebellion to make art. And this has a major impact. It has a major impact in the press because people see this as protest art, but it's not the raised fist, right? It's abstract, but it's still making this comment. So, that is his kind of major contribution. We get to chapter 3, called Organize, building an exhibitionary complex. And of course, we have the brothers Dale Brockman Davis and Alonzo Davis, who in 1967 open the Brockman Gallery. It's always been amazing to me that the Ferris Gallery, which people talk about with Walter Hopps and Ed Kienholz, there's so much research on that, right? It's open only for about 9 years. It actually closes the year that Brockman opens. Brockman is open for over 20 years. There is so little literature up to this point on that. That's changing. But the disparity always shocked me. They're in place for almost 3 times as long. And make such an impact. And people like Dale and Alonzo make a commitment to showing, they're artists, but they make a commitment to showing the work of their colleagues, because there really are, nobody's showing the work of African American artists. Other people who are part of this are Suzanne Jackson, who had Gallery 32 only open for a couple of years. The kind of most, storied show that she would have is showing the work of Emory Douglas, who is, of course, the Minister of Information for the Black Panther Party. And but not, if you look at the Black Panther magazine, you'll see a lot of his illustrations, but that's not what she's showing. What he was showing, and I haven't seen them yet. I really want to locate one of these. They talk about nice pastels of the Panther leaders, which sounds like something ironic. But anyway, this is an important show that she does. And then finally, Samela Lewis. Samela Lewis is an amazing person. She's already an academic. She works first at LACMA in the education department, kind of diversifying things for them. She says they're too slow. She goes on, she starts 3 galleries, writes several books, does 3 movies, produces a magazine that is still in print, International Review of African American Art, and actually starts a museum that's now in Macy's, used to be the May Company, but still up there. And she's doing all this while working full-time as a professor at Scripps College. And I always ask her, like, how did you do that? And she said, oh, it's about collaboration. Like, it's so simple. I was like, yeah. So, I was really, energized. And they're all artists. And you'll see their work zipping by here. And so I wanted to also pay homage to that. And the final chapter, In Motion, is about some of the artists that you know best, right? That are best known, I guess, in the larger art world, if you will. David Hammons being one. And David Hammons, many, 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 many years ago, when I met him, I did this interview with him in the 80s, and he's telling me about all these people, John Riddle, Noah Purfoy. I'd never heard of these people. Over the years, I did a lot of work with David. I came back to that, and I said, you know what? I really feel part of my understanding of art history, or building what an art history is for African Americans or people in the African diaspora, is to not just look at the sole genius, usually a man, and mostly in art history, not a person of color. I wanted to know what was the community that produced them. And I think David, over the years, always gave me tips about that. In the 80s, I also met Marin Hassinger, Sengen Ngudi, and Houston Conwell. So I met all these people in New York. And but I was fascinated to go back to see that actually in the 70s in LA is where they got their aesthetic. And then in the 80s, they brought it to New York when I was coming into consciousness as a curator. So I wanted to celebrate that. And then also what they brought with them was a very strong multimedia practice, sculptural for the most part, but also linked to performance, right? So now, in light of working on this book, I can see that it really is so much part of a California aesthetic, this strong multimedia presence that's so different from the East Coast. On the East Coast, because it's an older kind of art world, right? You have painting, sculpture, performance. It's very, different. There are those categories. People came to California, they just put it all together. And, this idea over the week has come up about freedom. And I did this research for many, many years, and I asked artists, I asked migrant people, I asked my family who had come to California, why did you come? What was it about California? And it always comes back to that idea of freedom, which sounds super corny. But, after all these years, I have to believe what people say, that they felt creative freedom in a way that was different for them, if we're looking at the art scene, than, they would feel in other places. I kind of end the book in the conclusion by looking at somebody, a younger artist, Sanford Biggers. You'll see his work with the piano called Blossom, floating by. And he, I chose him because he grew up in LA, really also working with a multimedia practice, and did something that I'm going to talk about in a minute, that he was very influenced by Asian cultures. He actually goes to Japan and teaches there for a year or two and makes all this work about hip hop and Japan and all this, and he's actually a colleague of mine at Columbia, and we were doing, I kept telling him, oh, you're in my book, so exciting. So we did a conversation once, and I told him, by the way, you're not the only person who's interested in Asia. In fact, these artists like David Hammons, like Sengen Ngugi and others, were really interested in Asian cultures. And he was like, what? Because he thought he had, he got a little shocked at first, but then he got into it because he realized that, he's part of this tradition, and he got more excited by that. Before I get into reading, which I will read about Sengen Ngugi, I want to tell you that some of these slides, like the ones that are on the screen now, were just given to me by Dale. I've never seen these. So these are some vintage images from that time that Dale has shared with us, and you'll see them coming right after. You'll see a picture of Alonzo standing with his work, and then these works come out, and it's right before this slide, the works that are right before this slide. So you'll see them come again, and you'll see that they look kind of vintage. So I am actually going to read from chapter 4, and I'm going to read a little bit about Sengen Ngugi and from this performance chapter. And, in honor of one of my great panelists, Uri McMillan, whose embodied avatar book you really have to read. And I'm so thankful. Uri studied with me and learned a little bit from me. So I'm glad to have been part of him in that way. And also, I also want to shout out my great colleague, Bridget Cooks, whose book, Exhibiting Blackness, another great book, I also cite particularly in the organized chapter, just in terms of what it means for African Americans to show in the American context. But let's get back to Sengen Ngugi. In the mid-1970s, Sengen Ngugi began to create what would become her signature works, free-form sculptures constructed primarily of nylon mesh, also known as pantyhose, and sand. Their skin-like forms stretched and pulled, and linear extensions and appendages were tied and knotted, shaped, twisted, and suspended from walls and ceilings. Their material and anthropomorphic form certainly suggested the body in motion. However, their pliant nature was not just part of an anti-sculptural environmental orientation or feminist bearing. They were supposed to be interacted with, caressed, fondled, and stroked by artists and viewers. It was through participatory three-dimensional works that movement and finally performance re-entered Ngugi's oeuvre as an important creative force. Ngugi's first full-length work of performance took place in April 1978. Ceremony for Freeway Fets was a public art project supported by a Comprehensive Educational Training Act, or CETA grant, and sponsored by Alonzo and Dale Davis's Brockman Gallery Productions and Caltrans, LA's transportation system. A one-time event, it took place under a section of the freeway near the convention center at a point of confluence of various routes. Ceremony for Freeway Fets began in the morning and lasted for perhaps an hour. A small orchestra composed of students and artists played saxophone, flute, drums, and other less traditional instruments. Nearly everyone was equipped with a form of Ngugi sculpture, from Frank Parker's knotted and twisted headdress to Rojo's full mask. Ngugi, Maren Hassinger, and David Hammons provided the work's major movement. However, it was Ngugi who seemed to truly embody and bring to life her sculptural practice. The tent-like structure that she moved inside brought together earlier ideas of fabric and movement that she explored in New York. With each step, her performative silhouette changed radically. She was crowned by a gathering of stuffed and knotted pantyhose and cloth scraps, some of which hung almost halfway down the tented costume. On one side, where a hand might have been, similar nylon forms cascaded forth, punctuating the air frequently and emphatically. Ceremony for Freeway Fets shares similarities with the larger aesthetic systems of West and Central African masquerades. By the 1960s and 70s, there was a growing holistic understanding, spurred by Robert Farris Thompson and Herbert M. Cole, among others, who saw performative totality as the driving aesthetic force. African art was not just a sculptural tour de force of utilitarian or figural icons or masks in wood. As Cole suggests, translation of these aesthetics should be tripartite and include mask, masking, and masquerade. There was not only the carved and polychrome headpiece, the mask, but the rest of the costume, made from fabric, grasses, beads, and other natural and man-made items. The legions of fully costumed characters, the rules of display, covering not only the head but the entire body, all this was masking. The concept of masquerade filled a larger universe, articulated through days of events with dancers, musicians, and their audiences. There was no doubt that Africa was on Sengen Ngudi's mind when she created Ceremony for Freeway Fêtes in 1978. She considered the space where she performed the African village of her mind's eye. Her collaborator, Marin Hassinger, characterized their dance movements as miming certain aspects of African dance. The performer's clothing was evocative of West African masquerade dress. We see this in Ngudi's title for the work, too. Fêtes is short for fetishes. Although perhaps retardere, it was a nod to Africa just the same. But it was the site itself under the freeway that evoked not only Africa but also its diasporic double, perhaps even more powerfully. While ceremonies of closed societies and initiations are hidden in private locales, the West and Central African masquerades to which I've referred take place in public spaces, marketplaces, and town squares, where they find the crucial audience component that completes their rationale. We find these logics of place in the Americas too, where similar aspects of the cityscape exert what Joseph Roach defines as a gravitational pull. He adds boulevards, theater districts, and cemeteries to the list, drawing performers and audiences to sites of commerce and pleasure. The location of Ngudi's performance was not accidental then, but incredibly strategic. It evoked not only Eshu's domain, the crossroads. Eshu is the deity practicing Yorubas must first acknowledge before petitioning all others, but also the New Orleans Carnival of Black Mardi Gras Indians who, according to Roach, parade on unannounced routes around the public housing projects and under highway overpasses, and transform these spaces into places of embodied memory. Such spaces attract vortices of behavior that constitute performance for Roach. These physical places are also among Pierre Nora's lieux de mémoire, or sites of memory, remains or indicators of ritual where objects or spaces stand in place of bodily knowledge, marking the intention to remember. In the logic of the diaspora that is not a direct or pure channel from Africa, Ngudi's performance, like that of the Black Mardi Gras Indians, is both public, outside, using the major routes of transportation, and liminal, following alternate paths in the dust and dirt beneath the freeway itself. It is the incarnation of Renato Rosaldo's explanation of ritual as a busy intersection. The growing Los Angeles freeway system was the site of increasing protests by citizens. Many of them were people of color whose neighborhoods and homes were being dismantled by government-organized programs of urban renewal to make way for the refurbishing of the city's downtown core. Often these were diverse neighborhoods, targeted because their incomprehensible demographics labeled them blighted, which did not replicate themselves in new locales. The most probable location of Ngudi's Ceremony for Freeway Fêtes was at the intersection of the Harbor, I-110, and Santa Monica, I-10 freeways. Both corridors were sites of extensive protest by African Americans because of the destruction and displacement the freeway system visited on their neighborhoods. However, just as art in the diaspora is not a strict duplication of African form, but a reinvention and redeployment for new and different situations, we can imagine that Sengen Ngudi had something else in her hip pocket. Her understanding of Africa is gleaned in part from Latino New York, for instance. In fact, in its imagination and facture, her work celebrates notions of modernity signified by trade routes, the new archetypes people communities and cultures that develop in modernity as a circulatory system of exchange and site of translation. It centralizes diasporic histories of Africa and the Americas in the making of the world we know as modern. But in looking west, Ngudi eventually arrived in the east, and then there was Japan. Curiosity about Asian art and philosophy eventually led Ngudi to Japan. She spent 1966 to 1967 in Tokyo, where she studied at Waseda University during the interval between her undergraduate and graduate years at Cal State Los Angeles. She was particularly fascinated by the unorthodox objects and exhibitions of the Gutai Art Association. Formed in 1954 in the Kansai region, Osaka, Kobe, Kyoto, around the figure of Hiro Yoshihara, during the mid to late 50s, Gutai experimented with mud, water, fabric, and air, as well as the incorporation of time in exhibitions that were held outdoors, in theaters, and in traditional spaces. In Japan, Ngudi broadened her knowledge of Japanese theatrical traditions, becoming more familiar with No, Kabuki, and Buto, and taking private art and dance classes. In the Japanese performative arts, the artist encountered ancient customs going back some 15 centuries. At the root of these forms was a shamanic tradition that predated Buddhism and Shinto religious practices and was pan-Asian in reach. Shamanic trance was performative and public and provided dramatic structure. The miko, or shaman, usually female, conjured the kami deity through dancing, rhythmic stamping, and singing. Ngudi's Afro-Asian experimentations seem more possible on the West Coast. With its Pacific coast facing the whole of Asia, California has a substantial history of embracing Asian aesthetics, certainly in ceramics and paintings by Sargent Johnson, Ken Price, and John McLaughlin. Ngudi thus followed a West Coast tradition of sorts. For this reason, it is also not surprising that these works did not read as Black art on the East Coast and did not fit into the requirements promoted by the Black arts movement. California represented that kind of embrace, the prospect of encompassing more. Thank you. So I welcome the rest of the panel to come up, join me. I'm done, now you guys can chat away. Way we wanted to sit.
No, wherever you're comfortable.
Well, thank you all for being here. I'm ready for y'all to ask me a question. We're going to talk for a while, and then we'll open it up to our wonderful audience here. So somebody can jump in.
You know, I don't mind starting because I had a passage marked early on in the book and one near the end of the book. And this one on page 5, it's very short. I just wanted to read to you and to everyone because it provided such an exciting framework for me. Some of the information I knew, a lot of it I didn't, and the level of detail that you bring to this text is remarkable and very much appreciated. So I just wanted to read this and ask you to say a little bit more. So on page 5, you say, for African Americans, moving west represented a relocation toward the openness of possibilities, a place without the same sedimented authority. It was a move toward non-fixity and flexibility, the no place of utopia. In this sense, the West became interchangeable with other locales that African Americans imagined offered prosperity and freedom from brutality and second-class citizenship. Was it a space in this country or a space in the world? Was it California, Africa, or Kansas?
Yeah, sounds crazy. Well, freedom, it's this idea of freedom. And I think, if we think of this long idea of African American migration, since, slavery, right? Ending of slavery, that people were looking for that. They were looking to get away from slavery. They were, they ended up in the South. They have no money. They have no resources. Many times people stay as sharecroppers, and that's just, warmed over slavery. Therefore, they want to get away, And so there's this idea of migration that is, you move from, you're in the rural area, you move to the small town in the South, then you move to the larger city in the South, then you move out of the South. But it takes a while to do that. And, one of the things about writing this book, I love these stories of people. These people, we're going through a lot in this country today, no doubt. But when you read what some of these people went through, to me, I love these stories. I imagine them. I guess it's my visual, I can see them before my eyes somehow. But, people who said, I'm getting out of here, I'm going to Africa, that's it. And then they run out of money in Chicago and they stay there. There's stories like that. You're like, okay, so the idea is, but also, if we look back at slavery time, people are getting to Canada. They have to get out of the country, right? So then these places replace Canada, right? They don't have to go to Canada anymore, but they have to go someplace. And also, if you look at the history of migration itself in the 20th century, the Great Migration, the people from South Carolina, North Carolina get to New York, New Jersey. The people from Alabama and Georgia go up and they go to Chicago. And then the people from Texas and Louisiana get to LA. But also LA is the kind of last place of the migration because people are also looking for jobs, right? And so you have the aerospace industry. You have JPL here, right? Jet Propulsion Lab, right? So people are working still, there's still jobs out here. So a lot of people come to that. They also want to stay with Dale, like Dale's family, they come into the warm climate. They, no, Chicago's cool, but, or they get to Chicago like John Otterbridge and they say, you know what, I got to get to something else, so they move. And I'll just say one more thing about this, which is my grandfather, the other thing was, two things actually. Marion Hassinger in the book has a line that says, we're all from the South, because the South touches every black person who has relatives in the 20th century, right? That migration. If you don't live in the South, somebody in your family actually left, So I used to, my grandfather was from South Carolina, and he always told me this story. He said, Kel, I was coming from the South, and they said Newark. He lived in Newark, New Jersey. They said Newark, and I got off because I thought they were saying New York. I didn't know. I'm from the South. I didn't know. So I believed. I was like, wow, that's a great story. Years later, I read Isabel Wilkerson's Warmth of Other Suns. The exact same story verbatim. I'm like, oh, my God, I thought that was my grandfather's story. But then I realized this is a tale that the migrants told, right? And in fact, if I really had thought about it, his older sister was already living in Newark. Why was he trying to get to New York? He wasn't. He was actually trying to get to Newark. So, but you realize that something you thought was so personal is actually archetypal. It's actually part of history. And it actually turns out to be wonderful after you got over the fact that your grandfather wasn't telling you the truth. So, it's all, freedom takes many forms. And also freedom, I think for me, ultimately, freedom is about what the artist made. That was another space of freedom, that you didn't have to get to. You could get to it right here.
I'll dovetail on that because my history is one of migration also. My family was from the Deep South, Anniston, Alabama, my mother's side, and we had parents that didn't get along, and so my mother brought my brother and myself to California via Birmingham, Chicago, Detroit, LA, and the reason we ended up in Los Angeles was because her brother was a red cap. And so he knew what was here. And he was the one who suggested that since the marriage didn't work, you need to get out, you need to go someplace else, you need to start anew. And so that's when my brother and I, my mom and aunt, the aunt next to her in the grouping, there were 11 children, got together and made the dynamic move to come to California.
I had a question about a line that's actually in the very beginning of the book, but I think it's a really striking line. It's like how the visual annotates history, and I was really interested in thinking about, because I think it's a really nice encompassation of the whole book, but also just because it's a really striking phrase. And I think in part because when I've taught the book in my Black visual culture class, what's really striking is how you really ground these visual artists within African American history. So the Great Migration is a big part of it, but also you talk a lot about spatial theory and actually the way that a lot of this is about artists kind of trying to create space for themselves and how that is actually reflected in the material conditions of the artwork itself. So I just wanted to kind of hear more about that.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, they're creating space. I think the other part of space I'm interested about is people who grow up in segregation or in the aftermath of, they're actually, most of these artists are growing up during segregation. If we want to say that 1954 Brown versus Board of Education is when it supposedly ends, right? So that also comes into play about what space is about. But it's also another way, as you said, to think about how we can reconsider the idea of an installation practice. We can reconsider the idea of what a multimedia practice is, based on different understandings of space and how people had to move their bodies in this country. How did they understand their body and space in this country? And then how does that then translate into an object? I think it's very different. I mean, somebody who's not in the book, well, she's in there, she's mentioned briefly, Elizabeth Catlett. She tells a story about teaching in New Orleans, and she can't, she's from DC, so she feels she's not really from the South, but she's teaching in New Orleans, and the New Orleans Museum of Art is in the middle of City Park. City Park is off limits to black people, even if, and this is in the 40s, even if the museum is not. But then how do you get there? So effectively the museum is off limits. But she, being the person that she was, engineered it so that she had a bus that went right to the steps of the museum, so they did not step in the park. And they went into the museum, and they go into the museum when the museum is closed to the regular public, i.e. white people, because of course black people and white people can't be in the same museum walking around together. That's just unheard of in New Orleans. And so they go in, and there's a Picasso show up. I think there's a Guernica's up. And just the students, amazing being able to see the art. I mean, you even think about, so how does that access or not access to great works of art in general, in a museum? Do you have that? How do you become an artist if you don't even see what any other people are doing? So that's another thing about space. And then one of those people in that class was actually Samela Lewis, right? Who then went on to study with her forever. But that's another thing about space that and I'm cognizant of that in my teaching too, because you can't just sit here with students in the 21st century and say, well, why does this work look different? And, black artists are always seen as, behind times. But let's think about it. Could they even go in a museum? Could they even go in an art shop and get the materials? You know what I mean? So we got to think about all these things before we make judgments on what and how people are making. And so that's where I was coming from with that.
To take it a step further, when I was at USC, very traditional but a very conservative environment, there was never any mention of what minorities were doing in art. And so I realized at a late date how much I had missed. And so as a high school teacher at an inner city school, I realized that my resistance to art history was the boring redundancy of slides and dates, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you're going to make a difference, you've got to own it. And so I would take work from the gallery and take the actual artwork, like work of David Hammons, Charles White, display it in the classroom, because I knew that I couldn't find adequate slides or have the facility to show it or to be able to reference it in a book. And so I had the good fortune to be able to take things from the gallery to the classroom and show it to the kids, which I couldn't read into what they were going through, but I know what kind of dynamic it meant. And I think looking back at it is probably the best gift that I probably could have ever given them.
Dale, I just want to follow up and see if you would talk to us a little, since you're in the book, if you would talk to us about some of the stories you told Kellie during her research. So what was it like coming here? You were a student at USC, an artist.
Let's take it all the way back
Okay.
to the arrival.
Okay,
which is about
let's go all the way back.
56. Okay, I'll give you the short version. The arrival from Tuskegee, which is a very insulated community, but a very aware community, to 6th Avenue Elementary School, where the population was one-half Japanese American children who are just coming back from concentration camps. Okay? So, 10 years old, all you really know is these are just different children. And then to have the awareness that, at the end of the school day, they all left and playtime was over and the whole culture left. And they left because they were going to Japanese language school. It took me years to figure out what that was about. And then to move on to Fauché Junior High School, which was a whole nother community-based awareness, to Dorsey High School, which again was another kind of basis, 1/3 Japanese American kids, very large population of Jewish kids and African American kids. And for those who know our community have heard the title or demarcation of the jungle. Well, when I was going to high school, the jungle was called the jungle because it was so well landscaped. Not for other reasons that we've heard about later. Right? So, yeah, it is. So, these were kind of like the entry points and contact points that were happening to me as a very young person. And because of the dynamic of the high school at the time, you had racist groups coming from Inglewood. We just break it down to reality. When Inglewood was an all-white, pretty much a poor-based community, where you had gangs like the Spook Hunters that would come to our school trying to pick off individuals, right? And I learned early the importance of sticking together. And so there was really a early understanding of the need to stay together.
And I'll just interject to say that was the other thing about California and freedom. It's like, it's not all that it's cracked up to be, right? I mean, that's the other thing about people looking still for that idea of freedom and peace, really. And then they get here and it's like, yeah, it's great, but then there are things like that. There are things like, certainly at the turn of the 20th century, when there were, there's public schools, when they're mixed, as Dale is recounting. But then at certain places, if you had 10 African Americans, the white people could leave, right? And so that created more segregated spaces. You have things like restrictive covenants that kept people apart. So it's not as you all know, you're here, is not always the land of milk and honey. You have the Watts Rebellion. So there's a lot of stuff going on. And I guess I just wanted to put that in the book. And, you know, like I said, Dale and his brother Alonzo. Alonzo has one of the, you know, giant oral histories, if you ever want to look at it, here at UCLA. You can even download it now from the library. I think another story that I liked about you all was, you know, in 1966 they get in their VW bug and they drive across the country looking at art, but also protesting, right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. The purpose of the trip was primarily to go and participate with the March on Jackson, which was a major piece to drive cross country through Texas, through all the states, realizing that wherever you stayed, you had to stay with family or friends. And then to be a part of that, where you had one of the first events that I'm aware of, where you had all of the desperate factions of the black community come together. So you had SNCC, CORE, NAACP, I'm sure the Panther Party was there, I'm sure other organizations were there, all together on the same grounds. So that was, you know, that's once again part of the formative years that we were blessed to be a part of, and then took the trip on to visit Fisk, other Atlanta University, to see, actually for the first time, see exhibits in the black community with art done by black people. It was a first. You'd never seen anything like that. And we continued the trip on through New York and worked our way back down. The fact that you mentioned the land covenants is important because Brockman Gallery was right in the middle of land covenant areas. You couldn't, as a minority, you couldn't move there. You couldn't rent there, right? And even though the covenants came off like around 55, it took another, 10 years for people to realize, there is an opportunity. Alonzo was a student at Pepperdine when Pepperdine, like a lot of major schools, was in the black community. There are probably people here that think Pepperdine is the Pepperdine that's on the hill, Malibu. Pepperdine was at Manchester in Vermont, okay? And, this is what makes you. These are the kinds of things that build character. And speaking of character, the art department chairperson that Alonzo worked with, whose name happened to be Mr. White, told him that he was talented, but he had better get a teaching credential because there was no place for an African American young person to show. So that was a hard reality. And so he did get his teaching credential. I did get my teaching credential. And we opened the gallery knowing that this was going to be a new thing. We had no business experience, and part of the legacy was being able to sit with my mother and my aunt around the round table to figure out how we would accomplish this, knowing that the suggestions that they made, which were very good, we were not about to embark on because it meant you need to go back to business school, you need this kind of training. I mean, these were the lectures, they were lectures. They were lectures, you listened. But we knew that we needed to do this, and make this move. And so we opened the gallery in 1967 in Lamar Park.
I think what I like about that particular story is when you read the book and you see them going in their VW bug around the country, one of the things that, that kind of, idea of freedom, we think of somebody like writer of the Beat Generation, Jack Kerouac, On the Road, right? And it's basically a great writer narrating, discovering America, and in that America is black people and black music. Black people are found there in the idea of music. So what I loved about this is that here they are in the classic car of the period, right? And they're going around and they're doing their thing and finding art. So that's one of the stories I love. There are a lot of stories, but I know you guys might have a few more questions before we turn it over to our great audience here.
It was something about going back to Block Hollywood. So I kind of agree with Bridget, just that there's so much detail that actually the footnotes of the book are almost like a whole nother book in themselves.
Yeah, my colleagues said that.
But, so I think particularly, because I think of like it doesn't a footnote of the book, but I think it's really interesting, it's like the Ruby D, so when you talk about the evidence of Ruby D being a collector, but literally the evidence is, an American Airlines piece of stationery that she writes to Charles White. So I was thinking about someone like her and also Eartha Kitt, Lorraine Hansberry, all of these Black women writers and actors who are also collectors. So I just wanted to kind of hear more about that because I think that's just another interesting piece of the puzzle. And also thinking about people like Marin and Singa, who were not encouraged to become artists. They actually became artists because they were told they couldn't be dancers. So I think even like that kind of component to me was really interesting too.
Well, I love the collector story, and part of that comes from him being in New York. So he actually meets a lot of these people in New York. They also become Hollywood stars, and when they become Hollywood stars, then they have money to buy stuff. So yes, I love that Ruby D. Oh, here's a little down payment. I'm writing this on the plane, on airline stationery. Airlines don't have stationery anymore, but it's fabulous. You find this in the archive. We love it. But Harry Belafonte has a lot of works. He actually gives Charles White one of his first shows here in the 50s, and a lot of it is Harry Belafonte works. Sidney Poitier, he's another one. He puts Charles White's work in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. He's in Matt Drayton, who is the Spencer Tracy characters. A piece of Charles White is in Matt Drayton's study. You can, go look, check it out. It's there. But then even more, it's an earlier film that also Poitier, and these are ones where Poitier is a major figure, right? So he has power. He's putting the art in there, and it's his art. But For the Love of Ivy, which he does with Abby Lincoln. And, he's the cool bachelor businessman, and she's the maid working for a white family. But they meet, and, his associate, Poitier's character's associate, takes Abby Lincoln to Sidney Poitier's swank bachelor pad. And the first thing you see, and it's actually the epigraph for that part of the chapter is, the artist is Charles White, and he shows her the work. Oh, this is a work by Charles White. Whoever sees that in the movies? You don't even see it now. Now you can see Kehinde Wiley and all these people on Empire and all that. But, 1960 whatever, that's in there, and they pan over it. And in the book, actually, I don't show the picture of the work. I show the picture in the film. So, I just love that, because also that's another thing that people talk about with Ferris Gallery, when you're thinking of the quote-unquote mainstream Ed Keynote's Walter Hopps, and part of that is bankrolled by Edward Hopper, right? And so the Hollywood people, the white Hollywood people, are supporting the Ferris, right? But then we see that we have all these other people and other theater people like Hansberry and others supporting Charles White. And then also with your question about Marin and Singa, absolutely. And Marin, it's even more stark because Marin danced for her whole life, from when she was 5 years old. And she goes to Bennington College, which is a college for dance, right? And she gets there and they tell her, oh no, you can't dance. You need to be an artist. And the line is, these people, like you see with Dale, they have great stories and great language. She says, well, how was I supposed to know about art when I just picked up a piece of clay? Why was I supposed to be a better artist than a dancer when I was like 18? She'd, been studying dance for over 10 years, but she wasn't a dancer. And the same happened to Singa, where they tell her that she doesn't have a dance body, right? And so that gets into another rabbit hole I went down that doesn't get in the book, thankfully, was the black ballerina thing, right? our interest in Misty Copeland because of these same ideas. Or for any of you who've read Alvin Ailey's autobiography, you should. I think it's called Revelation, where he talks in depth about how the dance world discriminates against the black body. So then they bring it back in art. It works out in the end.
I had one more thing. I didn't know how we're doing on time, but
That's probably good, and then we can open it up.
okay. So one of the things I appreciate about the book is how, the discourse is focused on African American artists in LA, but you take time in every chapter to talk about what mainstream artists were doing at the same time and how materials are shared and themes are shared. But you then go further, instead of just sort of mentioning that, you say, and here's how they're the same and here's how they're different. And the comparison, I remember them all, but the one that I really am going to really make sure I bring into the classroom regularly is when you talk about violence in performance. We're talking about Osco, when you're talking about Chris Burden's Shoot, and you're talking about David Hammond's murder mystery performances. And so I just wanted to, this is on 235, and it's a short section I'm just going to read here. Both Hammonds and Burden used art to call attention to brutality afflicting the body and the body politic. But Hammonds declined to put himself in harm's way for the next action, while Burden took that leap. Was this because Hammonds knew that, beginning at birth, the black body was under attack in the United States? For Hammonds to be shot was indeed unremarkable and eminently possible, while it pushed Burden into a new realm of experience. Right? I read that a couple of times because it was so nice for you to put, and you talk about Osco also, but I'm just not mentioning it in this quotation, but it was so nice for you to put those works in conversation with each other and then to help us as readers articulate how the body of the artist and the sensibility and experience and the social really does become part of the differences of the reality of the work and its impact.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think that's what we have to be true to that. Not all experience of art making is the same. In Suzanne Jackson's, and a lot of these oral histories reference each other because this is a community. And that was the other thing. I wanted to think about, art made in a community. And Suzanne Jackson says about David Hammonds, he would walk down the street then with half his head shaved and this part of his head shaved, this part of his face shaved, and walk down the street. And he would be stopped, right? This is, not an art action. What was a black man doing there? There's something wrong there. So that even that just showed that, what was at stake with performance. And, not to say that Chris Burden wasn't brave in his things, but that they were different. And they were different for the bodies that made them. So, yeah. So with that, I want to thank my great colleagues, panel, artists. These guys are the best. And I want to open it up to you all here. I don't know how this is going to work, but somebody might have a microphone in the back who's coming down. Come on down. Yeah.
Hello. Hi, my name is Ariel. I was in Yuri's class. I know Bridget. Hi, I've never met you before, but I'd love to talk to you. So I was in Yuri's class when we read your book. I'm pretty sure we were probably the first class in America to read your book for class. And it's like Black visual culture. It was lit. And you talk about the archetype of Southern migration. And as a graduate student, I'm thinking about the way you utilize a lot of theories to become one. Like even in the passage that Ms. Cooks just read, that is a very succinct like performance analysis, as well as with like kind of a critical race lens. And I'm just wondering, in terms of starting to generate my own practice, how do you go about deciding which theories to use? Because as I pointed in Yuri's class, some of these theories just you wouldn't think they make sense together. I think at one point you used Sarah Ahmed's work and like with someone else, and I was just like, what? I was literally reading the introduction like, what in the world is going on here? And I just want to know how you go about generating that, because that's the kind of experience that I'd like to generate in my readers in the future. So.
Okay. You know, I was at UC Irvine yesterday, and somebody asked a similar question, about different but similar. I think you just use what works. You know, use what works for you. You know, Sarah Ahmed wants you to use her work, and Jose Munoz and Uri McMillan and Bridget Cooks. You know, we're all in dialogue. You know, if you're reading in another language, put them in there. If it says what you want to say, and you can textualize it for what you want to do. Like, I'm using Chris Burden to talk about David Hammons. Oh, well, gee, he should be happy. I mean, you know, in a way, but I mean, I think he would be happy to be in dialogue, you know, and I think these writers are happy to be in dialogue. So I think it's about reading a lot and then deciding what your project is and deciding what goes where. And some things fall out. You know, some things fall out of the book, too. You know, but it's in a folder, it's another book. You know, it's another article. So just keep reading, because there are a lot of great people. They don't always write about African Americans, right? And but doesn't mean they can't give you something for your project.
Please hold for the microphone.
Okay, so the piece about the black body, your book was off the hook, and I'm looking at it in conversation with your book as you speak about the black body. There's, you know, as a black person, I'm one of those dancers that they said you should look about doing some other stuff too, because your body's not the type, right? But the other piece of it is there's some knowings about the embodied experience that you just bring with you. So it's not strange to me that you would point out that artists dealing with black subject matters in black bodies, painting black bodies, would have this kind of intersection of experience with the body and performance, or as it's seen by the other and by the self and the self seeing itself. I mean, I don't know if I'm making sense to you, but what I got was like, this was perfectly logical. It made sense to me, it connected. It wasn't strange that Hammons would say, yeah, I'm not gonna shoot myself because I can be shot. I know what that's like. But at the same time, wanting to explore the impact of the violence, you know, or the body being attacked, or all of that. So just the discourse isn't limited, but expansive, and it intersects a lot. So thanks for allowing us to not just have an intellectual or conceptual piece of it, but grounding it. That piece about the visual being the annotation for ideas, and that piece, I don't know if that's what you said, but that's what I got, was that it's like, I understand the language because I can see the image. I get to see it. It becomes alive. It's present. It's like that 3D, like there it is. So thank you.
Thank you. Other questions?
Hi, you said that you had to narrow your scope down to about 13 artists, and I was wondering how you made that selection, what the process was.
You know, that's why Now Dig This was a gift, because I probably still would have been writing the book. But I figured, you know, some people had more information out there than others, and some people, you know, for instance, let's just say John Riddle. When we started the project, John Riddle is renowned in this area in LA. But when we started the project, the only thing we found written on him, we found two things: his own oral history, his obituaries. That's it. And so we did so much work with Now Dig This to create, I mean, now there's that biography. Now there's more stuff being written about him. So I think there, I chose the figures that had, some of them had the oral histories, but also the stories that I wanted to tell. I still wanted to tell the story about the exhibitions. And that became even more important when I read Bridget Cook's book, Exhibiting Blackness, about the history of African American exhibitions in this country, and another great book by my colleague Mabel Wilson at Columbia Negro Building. And, as my lovely husband will tell you, Guthrie Ramsey, I, for many years, have been saying, oh, this is my last show. I'm not going to do one more show. That's it. I'm done. It's too hard. But then, reading those books and seeing that, guess who's a curator? Guess who's using what Tony Bennett calls the exhibitionary complex? Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, Alain Locke. They thought making exhibitions was an important way to tell history and to tell people what African Americans and people in the African diaspora had been up to. And so once I read that, I was like, wait a minute, okay, I guess I can't stop being a curator because they were curators. But then I had already, I wrote so much in that chapter about that I had to cut all that 19th century stuff out. But, and there are other stories. I talk a little bit about Miriam Matthews. She's another person I want to go back and write an article about. So it just was really about how, what story I want to tell. And I see another important person who makes an appearance in the book. I believe Stan Sanders is here. And he's an important collector. He was important for the Watts Rebellion, and he has a wonderful, some wonderful writing about what the rebellion meant as the Watts riots as a form of communication. So I just want to acknowledge him being here. But, yeah, you can't put every story in, just like as a curator, you can't put every artist in one show. You got to have more places to have them. Two more questions.
Thank you. My name is Ann Isolda, and I'd like to have Dale talk a little bit about, there's the Brockman Gallery, but what other things were going on in the community at the time, like the Black Arts Alliance at LACMA, and who started that, and what about the Compton Communicative Art Academy, and all the other things that were happening that are like a broad scope of activities in the community, and what that meant to all of you.
Very big question with a very short period of time to address it. The gallery opened during a very vibrant period, and so you had a lot of conflict with different groups within the black community, but at the same time, each institution was supporting the other. And so you were aware, for example, that the Communicative Arts Academy, which was in Compton, and you keep hearing certain names over and over again, John Outerbridge, Noah Purefoy, Horace Tapscott. Some of these people are not visual artists, but musicians. But you had collectives that were forming major connections within the community. And so really the time was really ripe for all these institutions that were really kind of all created within maybe a 10 or 15 year period. There were things that were happening at the Watchtowers. There's certain institutions you keep hearing about that were maybe more dominant because they lived longer. For example, the Watchtowers Art Center and Towers themselves by Simon Radia are still going on after all these years. And so the need was so great and is still so great that the idea of a comprehensive collective is still part of the basis for what we're talking about today. It was
Last-
Watts Writers Workshop, Posla, I mean, long list. Studio Watts. There was also an institution called the Inner City Cultural Center that's no longer here. You know, yeah,
All of these need books.
you know,
Writers, all of these need books.
right.
Okay,
And,
last.
you know, one last piece. I would like to acknowledge anybody in the room. I won't try to pick out people, but anybody in the room who has lived a part of the life that we're talking about. Could you raise your hand or do something? There are a lot of you here, right? Thank you for coming. Thank you for being a part. Joe, I didn't see your hand. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, our last question.
Hello, my name is Marcus. I'm also a student of Uri McMillan. Wanted to thank you for what you shared about your grandfather and those tall tales, I guess. I recently lost my grandfather. He's from Alabama as well, and our whole family is a part of that great migration, first and second wave. And he would tell stories about traveling on a train and landing in Chicago for the first time and leaving family members behind that settled and didn't. So I connect to that as well. But he also talked about art in a way where he would say he would sketch, and he would also draw with charcoal and things like that. And when you talk about the disbelief in the stories, and then I didn't, until he passed away and we were like digging through his art, his satchels, mostly from World War II. So digging through all this war memorabilia, and in one of the satchels we actually found those drawings. And so I wonder, like, if there's a direction to start trying to search for what art or what part of that history was actually existing before it became settled in the areas where we're actually focusing on.
Well, you definitely should, try to have a show of those objects from your grandfather, and just say who he was and, part of the migration. Another thing you can really think about doing with them is donating them to a museum if that time comes. The National African American Museum of History and Culture has been collecting these type of things in Washington, D.C. I'm sure they would be interested in it. But, you need to think of, what you want to do with that. But it sounds super fantastic. You can show it to Professor McMillan. I'm sure he'd like to know about it. Or we also have Professor Stephen Nelson here in the art history department who may want to take a look. So, I would say think about that, and then think about, what other memorabilia by him can go with that, and maybe create your own exhibition. There are other places that may be interested in, Underground Museum. There's a lot of California African American Museum.
Mamie Clayton Archive.
Right.
In Culver City.
Right.
You should definitely go by there.
Yep. So, okay, very last.
I would like to take the liberty on behalf of all of those hands that had gone up a minute ago to show our gratitude to both Dale and Alonzo for the courage and the footprint that you've left in Leimert Park for all of the other artists who've benefited from your courage. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.